So we get this image that Christianity is at war with science. And science continues to learn things day by day, week by week, year by year, that somehow show that Christianity is not true and that God is not needed. We can explain everything scientifically. So, for example, not long ago, a very well-known Ivy League biology professor made the following statement. He said, quote, "Let me summarize my views on what modern evolutionary biology tells us loudly and clearly. There are no gods. There are no purposes in life. There are no goal-directed forces of any kind. There's no life after death. When I die, I'm absolutely certain that I'm going to be dead, and that's the end of me. There's no ultimate foundation for ethics. There's no ultimate meaning to life, and there's no such thing as free will either." Now, when the evening news and the major news media, which turns out to be a rumor mill for science, pop science, when you hear these kinds of pronunciations repeatedly, if you're not careful, it's easy to get hunkered down and to think that somehow science is the enemy of the faith, and it's actually the more they learn, the more it becomes implausible to believe that Christianity is really true. Now, actually, nothing could be further from the truth, but that is basically the assumption that an awful lot of people have today. And the record on this really does need to be corrected, because this is really false. I don't have time today, nor would it be fruitful for me to take this professor's statement apart, but it is a laughably inadequate statement. It is literally laughable. It is so misspoken and so poorly argued. But what I do want to do in our time together is I want to try to discuss in a way that I hope will help you a little bit more about the relationship between science and Christianity, to show that this picture that is widely circulated is really not true. And I want to proceed in the following way. I want to first of all talk about something called scientism. Then I'm going to talk about areas where scientific discoveries are actually supporting Christianity. And then I'm going to talk about some problem areas that we need to do more work on. And at the end of the day, my conclusion will be that science is actually supporting Christianity more than it's harming it, but there are areas of question that we need to work on. That will be my ultimate conclusion. So I want to begin with a discussion of something called scientism. Years ago, I was invited to do an evangelistic talk in Baltimore, Maryland, and I was warned that a PhD from Johns Hopkins in physics was going to be there, and this gentleman hated Christianity and religion, thought it was a bunch of nonsense, and that he would be at this meeting. So we were at the hors d'oeuvre table before the meeting gathered, and this gentleman came to the hors d'oeuvre table and was introduced to me. And no sooner than we had exchanged pleasantries than this gentleman said, "Well, I understand that you're a philosopher and a theologian," to me. And I said, "Well, I give it my best shot." And he said, "Yeah," he said, "I used to be interested in philosophy when I was a teenager. But," he said, "when I grew up, I outgrew it. Because I came to realize that if you can't prove it and test it in the laboratory, it's nothing but a bunch of nonsense and idle opinion. And you can't test philosophy or religious claims in the lab, so it's just a bunch of hot air." Well, that's how he introduced himself to me. Now, that is scientism. And scientism is basically the idea that science is the only way that we can know reality. That science is the only way that we can know reality. In other words, the only truths that you can really know are the truths that can be proven by the hard sciences. So we could know, for example, whether or not water was H2O or H3O, because science could tell us which answer was correct. We could know what a magnetic field is like and how magnetism relates to electricity, because science can answer that question. We could know how amphibians evolved from fish because the science of biology and paleontology can answer those questions. You can't know whether abortion's right or wrong because that's not a scientifically amenable question. You can't know what the state ought to do with health care because that's a political question and it's not capable of being answered scientifically. You can't know that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself or whether Allah is God because those questions cannot be tested or proven and resolved scientifically. It is only scientific questions that we can really know. And everything else is nothing but a bunch of hot air and idle opinion. Now, this is widely believed among people, and I would bet that you have a relative or a friend or someone you know that actually holds this view. Let me say a couple of words about scientism. You understand the view? You feel pretty comfortable with it? It's the claim that something is true and can be known if and only if it can be tested scientifically. Okay, that's basically the idea. Now, the problem, there are many problems with this, and I'll give you a couple of them. The first problem is that scientism is self-refuting. Scientism is self-refuting. Now, let me unpack this. Something is self-refuting if it falsifies itself. Something is self-refuting if it makes itself false. Let me give you an example. There is no sentence longer than 3 words is self-refuting. That sentence makes itself false. Or again, I cannot utter a word of English would be an example of something that's self-refuting. Or the statement, there are no truths, would be self-refuting because that statement itself is being offered as a truth. Now, the problem with scientism is that you cannot tell whether scientism is true by the methods of science. And so if someone says that you can only believe what science can prove, then you couldn't believe scientism because the statement, you can only believe what science can prove, cannot itself be proven by a physics experiment or in a chem lab or in a biology text or in neuroscience or anything like that. In fact, the statement that you can only know what science can prove is a philosophical statement in a branch of philosophy known as epistemology. And so the proper people to evaluate this statement would be epistemologists, people that specialize in the theory of knowledge. On our faculty at Talbot School of Theology, we have 3 professors that are specialists in epistemology. That's their area of academic emphasis. The statement, you can only know what you can prove scientifically, is a philosophical statement that implies that you can't know any philosophical statements. Okay? It is a non-scientific utterance that implies that you can't trust any non-scientific utterances. So I said to the gentleman, I let him go for a couple of minutes. And finally I said, look, I don't know what to do with what you're telling me here, sir, and I'm in a bit of a pickle. Because I said, you've been saying that the only thing that you can know is what can be proven scientifically, and the rest of it's nothing but hot air and idle opinion. Yeah, that's exactly my view. Well, you've been talking for 2 minutes, and so far I can't think of a single sentence that's come out of your mouth that I could test scientifically. No, and then I said, if I'm wrong, tell me which one it was. I'm open to tell me which sentence that you've uttered and how you would test it in a laboratory. But you see, my problem is that if none of your own sentences can be tested scientifically, it turns out that you've been espousing hot air for 2 minutes. Now, you see, this is a serious problem because people will engage in self-refuting statements all the time. They'll say there are no moral absolutes and you ought to be more tolerant. Well, if there are no moral absolutes, how does it follow that I ought to do anything? You understand? So what you have to do is you have to learn to listen for this mistake. So the first problem with scientism is that it's self-refuting. The second problem with scientism is that it fails to recognize that there are assumptions of science that can't be proven by science. It fails to recognize that there are assumptions of science that can't be proven by science. Science makes a lot of assumptions. For example, science assumes that there is a certain thing called truth. Science assumes that mathematics applies to the world, and so on. And I don't have time this day to list the assumptions of science. But science is based on a number of assumptions, and those assumptions cannot themselves be proven scientifically. Again, for example, the notion that there is such a thing as truth and what truth is. When a scientist says that my theories are true, he or she is assuming a certain model of what truth is. But that model of what truth is not a scientific assertion. It is an assertion in other fields. And anybody with an ounce of sense who's been to college would know this, because all you have to do is get a catalog of any university and look at what subjects are taught in what disciplines. And you will not find a seminar in undergraduate or graduate physics or chemistry or biology or neuroscience on the topic, what is truth? Scientists have no clue about that sort of thing. They borrow a view of truth in order to say their views are true. Fair enough. I have no problem with them borrowing. I just don't like it when they borrow and say that you have to shoot the person that you borrowed from. That doesn't make any sense. So, the reason that I believe scientism is false is that, first of all, it's self-refuting, and secondly, it fails to recognize that there are assumptions of science that can't be proven by science. An example of that would be, what sort of a thing is truth, and is there such a thing as truth? That is not something a scientific experiment could tell one way or the other. Now, so that has to do with scientism. That's the first thing I want to mention. The second thing that I'd like to plant firmly in your attention is that 95% of science is irrelevant to Christianity. The overwhelming, and I mean the overwhelming majority of scientific discoveries have nothing whatsoever to do with whether Jesus Christ was the Son of God, whether he rose from the dead, whether there is salvation outside of Christ, whether God exists, whether there's life after death, or what have you. I mean, I could care less whether water's H2O or H15O. It just doesn't make any difference to me as a Christian. And what you have to recognize is that 95% of the discoveries of science are talking about something that has nothing to do with ethics or God or anything of that sort of thing. So this idea that Christianity is at war with science is just nonsense, because in most cases they're talking about totally different things. They have nothing to do with each other. Do you understand that? And so, I mean, you take a look at a doctor who says, well, this antibiotic will work for that, but that one won't. Well, does it follow from that Christ didn't die for everybody? You get the point here. So I have an undergraduate degree in chemistry. I celebrate science. I actually think that science came from Christian Europe, and that was not an accident. But I do not believe that most of science has anything to do with my practice as a believing Christian. They're different areas of life, that's all. So if anybody tells you that science has undermined Christianity, you need to mention to them that you use a radio and you believe in television sets, and you don't think there's anything wrong with medicine or what have you. And you use air conditioning, and you're perfectly content to do all these things and love Jesus at the same time, and there's no contradiction in it. I mean, it's just ridiculous.